Hey guys, tonight we'll delve into a tragic and mysterious story about one of the most controversial figures in English history. Most people know about King Henry VIII and his 6 wives through a familiar rhyme, but few truly understand the hidden story behind the short life of his 5th wife, Katherine Howard. She was often given negative labels, seen as a frivolous and licentious queen. She was queen for less than 2 years, and ended her life on the execution block while still very young. But were those accusations the whole truth? Is there another perspective? A story yet to be told, waiting to be revealed. A story about stolen innocence. About a girl who endured a cruel fate until her final moments. She was executed by beheading, a horrifying and painful death, on the very same block where her cousin fell. That cousin was Anne Boleyn, also a queen who met a similarly tragic end 6 years earlier. Catherine's death wasn't just a conclusion. It was a cruel sentence for a girl who had not yet reached adulthood. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. To understand Catherine, we must first drift back to the early 16th century, when England's kingdoms still smelled of wood smoke and candle wax, and the hush of dawn settled over misted fields. She was born into the storied House of Howard, a family whose very name spoke of power and prestige. Her father, Lord Edmund Howard, was himself the 3rd son of the formidable Duke of Norfolk, a man whose influence reached into the highest councils of the realm. Her mother, Joyce Culper, known in refined circles as Jocasta Culper, mirrored her husband's noble lineage with remarkable fortitude, guiding 11 children safely into adulthood, a feat nearly unheard of in an age when cradle mortality often claimed the young before they took their first steps. Of those 11, 5 were born to Joyce's first marriage, and 6 more to Edmund Howard. Catherine stood as the 2nd youngest in that latter brood, her cradle surrounded by chubby siblings whose laughter echoed through their stately home. Yet the precise hour of Catherine's birth remains veiled by time, a gentle mystery that scholars still ponder. Some whisper that she first drew breath near 1518, while others place her arrival closer to 1527. The scales of evidence, however, tip toward a date somewhere between 1522 and 1525. In 1524, Sir John Lee Joyce's former father-in-law penned his will and named only the elder Lee children, omitting any mention of Catherine or her sister Isabel. Then, in 1527, Catherine's maternal grandmother explicitly included both girls in her testament. If we accept those clues, we see a little girl of about 6 years standing at her mother's graveside, the warmth of a guiding hand suddenly gone, leaving her poised on the threshold between childhood and a world of somber shadows. Lord Edmund Howard, despite his aristocratic blood, struggled beneath the weight of financial strain. His house in Lambeth stood with dignified grace beside the river's edge, its stone walls catching the weak glow of early sunrise. Yet inside, the hush of anxious discussions echoed in dimly lit corridors. As a younger son of a great duke, Edmund inherited little more than his title, and Tudor etiquette frowned upon paid labour for a gentleman of his station. Still, to preserve the family's reputation and to provide for his numerous offspring, he served as a local magistrate, dispensing justice in robes that brushed against worn stone floors. Later he took a post as financial controller in Calais, overseeing shipments of wool and wine that braved the restless Channel waves. All the same, each silver coin he earned seemed to slip from his grasp like water through fingers. His ledgers recorded borrowed sums from well-meaning acquaintances, followed by pleas for deferred repayment, and sometimes abrupt absences to evade insistent creditors whose letters piled like autumn leaves on his desk. After the grief of losing his wife, Edmund resolved that Catherine's upbringing would be best secured under the watchful eye of her grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Thus, the young girl was sent to the Duchess's grand estates, among them Chaworth House in Sussex, where high stone arches and manicured gardens spoke of refinement and decorum. There, noble daughters learned the arts required for a life at court. The whisper, soft bend of the knee for curtsies, the measured elegance of courtly speech, the disciplined grace of dance, and the hushed beauty of music. In the great halls, tutors led Catherine and her companions through lessons in Latin prayers and proper handwriting, their quills scratching in time with the distant tolling of chapel bells. Life at the Duchess's residences seemed idyllic on its surface. In sun-dappled courtyards, Catherine and other young ladies chased one another's skirts in laughter that glittered like dew. Inside, velvet draperies and polished oak tables gleamed in the glow of tallow candles, and the scent of freshly baked bread drifted from the kitchens where maids moved in silent choreography. Yet amid the elegance lay the constant hum of observation. Servants glanced knowingly from behind embroidered tapestries, and whispers floated on currents of trimmed hedges, carrying tales of alliances and courtly intrigues. Though they were shielded from want, the girls lived in a world where every gesture was noted, every slip of propriety recorded in gossip-laden corners. It was within this environment of cultivated perfection that Catherine faced her first stirrings of turmoil. Under the Duchess's guardianship, the young noblewoman found herself drawn into relationships that today would be viewed through a far different lens. Around 1536, when she was roughly 14 or, by some reckonings, 13, she encountered her music tutor, Henry Manox. He was a sensitive, impetuous young musician whose attention lingered on Catherine more than decorum allowed. In candlelit practice rooms, he guided her fingers across the virginal's ivory keys, offering new compositions that highlighted her growing skill. As they moved through arched corridors, their footsteps whispered secrets of forbidden closeness. One afternoon, the Dowager Duchess chanced upon the two in a moment of stolen intimacy near the chapel's entrance. Appalled, she struck Catherine in sudden anger and issued a strict command. The relationship must end immediately, and neither was ever to be found alone with the other again. Yet the edict carried little power over hearts, still learning the tumultuous pull of affection. In the hush of secluded chambers, Manox's fingers would brush Catherine's as they navigated musical passages, and their whispered vows drifted through the air like lingering notes of a melody that refused to die. Thus, in the very heart of a household designed to mould her into a paragon of noble virtue, Catherine's life encountered its first true tempest. Amid lessons in etiquette and harmony, she discovered that the sweetest songs can harbour the most poignant crescendos of sorrow, and that even the most carefully tended blooms of innocence can wither under the weight of clandestine passion. In that gilded sanctuary, the seeds of her tragedy were sown, preparing the way for the storms that would shape her destiny beyond the walls of Chaworth House. Around 1536, when Catherine was but 13 or 14 years old, she first encountered her music instructor, Henry Manox. Manox was a young musician, sensitive, impetuous, and full of ardour, whose devotion to his pupil soon went far beyond the bounds of a proper tutor's care. In the soft glow of candlelit practice rooms, he would linger at her side, guiding her slender fingers across the virginal's keys. His compliments echoed in the hush, and his eyes watched her with an intensity that put the very music to shame. Their relationship quickly slipped past the confines of lesson and refrain. One afternoon, as the late summer sun slanted through the chapel's narrow windows at Chaworth House, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk chanced upon the pair in a moment too intimate for propriety. The two stood close beside the stone font, lips meeting in a secret kiss. Shocked, the Duchess reproached Catherine with a sharp slap, her voice crackling like a distant thunderclap. She forbade further meetings and ordered that Manox never again be left alone with her granddaughter. Yet, despite the stern decree, Catherine and Manox could not resist their tender attachment. They found solace in hidden corners of the manor behind velvet draperies, and in arbours heavy with honeysuckle, where their whispered vows fluttered like moths around a flame. By 1538, Manox had confided to servants that their intimacy had grown physical, and Catherine, though burdened with shame, did not deny it. Historians Christopher Day and Neil Johnston later would argue that the disparity in their ages, Manox perhaps 20 years, her senior, cast this liaison in the harsh light of exploitation. Even if some accounts suggest a smaller age gap, modern understanding classifies Manox's attentions as a grievous abuse of trust. In the aftermath of that painful episode, Catherine resolved to sever her ties with Manox. She felt betrayed that he had spread intimate details among the household staff, tarnishing her innocence with rumoured seductions. Determined to reclaim her dignity, she cut him off without hesitation, leaving Manox to nurse his wounded pride. Yet the wound in Catherine's soul would take far longer to heal. Almost immediately after, another figure stepped into her life. Francis Derham, the Dowager Duchess's secretary. A man of slender frame and eager wit, Derham possessed a confidence that magnetized Catherine. He would slip into the communal dormitory at dusk, carrying baskets of fruit and flasks of wine, his footsteps muffled against the tapestry-lined floors. In the half-light they spoke of dreams and futures, and it soon became clear that Derham considered himself her betrothed. He would call her wife, and she, in a trembling voice, at times called him husband. Rumours of Catherine's virginity lost swirled through the corridors, but she bore them with a proud tilt of her chin rather than shame. The Dowager Duchess, upon catching wind of Catherine's new attachment, issued yet another rebuke. She forbade further clandestine meetings and demanded that Derham maintain formal distance. Yet, in her judgment, she erred grievously. She neither dismissed Derham from his post, nor removed Catherine from his reach. In that moment of oversight, she inadvertently sanctioned months of whispered rendezvous. During those months, Catherine and Derham's ardour simmered and boiled like wine left too long in a warm cellar. Their letters, filled with vows of undying devotion, passed through the hands of cautious servants. In moonlit gardens, they wandered together beneath ancient yews, their laughter mingling with the night's hush. Derham spoke often of a future bound by rings and royal favour, and Catherine, her heart still tender from past betrayals, allowed herself to believe his promises. But as the seasons turned and Catherine approached her 15th year the age, when a noble lady might catch the eye of Princes, Derham's admiration curdled into possessiveness. He demanded that Catherine prove her affection at his whim, his jealous whispers creeping like ivy around her spirit. Recognizing his overreach, Catherine felt the tender bloom of their romance wither under the weight of his demands. In the spring of 1539, she summoned the courage to end their liaison, leaving Derham to wander the corridors with hollow eyes, his unspoken pleas echoing in empty rooms. Those months of entanglement, first with Manox, then with Derham, would later be dredged from Catherine's past and wielded against her in the stark light of royal inquiry. Each whispered confession, each stolen tryst, became evidence when the edicts of Henry's court demanded proof of her fidelity. Yet in those youthful moments, Catherine stood not as a calculating conspirator, but as a girl swept along by the currents of broken trust and ill-fated desire, seeking in secret embraces the comfort that duty and decorum could not provide. And so her story, woven from threads of affection and betrayal, would come to shape the tragic tapestry of her brief and storm-tossed life. In the autumn of 1539, as the breath of winter began to stir in England's fields, Henry VIII prepared to dissolve his brief union with Anne of Cleves. The icy wind that swept across the green ramparts of Calais heralded more than a change of season. It marked a turning point in the fortunes of a young noblewoman named Katherine Howard. Roughly 14 years old and newly orphaned by her father's death, she was sent by the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk to serve in Anne of Cleves's household, a customary arrangement for ladies of her station. There, amid corridors lined with tapestries and chambers aglow with torchlight, Catherine encountered a figure whose presence would alter the course of her life: Thomas Culper. Culper was a member of the king's privy chamber, a world of silk and secrets hidden from the gaze of ordinary courtiers. Tall and lithe, with dark hair that curled at his temples, and eyes that gleamed with confidence, he embodied the ideal of Tudor gallantry. Known for his quick wit and deft hand at the hunt, he moved among noblemen and ladies alike with a grace that bespoke private instruction and royal favour. To Catherine, still tender from the losses of childhood, and yet eager for companionship, he seemed both protector and playmate, a gentle guide through the intricacies of courtly life. Their acquaintance bloomed naturally within the hushed elegance of Anne's household. In sunlit galleries, they exchanged shy smiles as Catherine curtsied with tentative charm. In the late afternoon hush, they practiced dance steps together, her small hand resting in his as they traced the measured patterns of the pavan. He presented her with blossoms plucked from the gardens, their petals soft and fragrant, and she tucked them into her bodice, savouring the warmth of his regard. Though rumours of Henry's impending annulment hung in the air like a distant storm cloud, each stolen moment with Culper felt like a sunlit respite. When Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was officially dissolved, it took but 19 days, an interval marked by courtly whispers and hurried ink on royal decrees before the king remarried. On the 28th of July 1540, Henry VIII and Katherine Howard were wed at Oatlands Palace in Surrey. That very day, Thomas Cromwell, the mastermind behind the Cleves match, met his own end on the scaffold, underscoring the perilous caprice of Tudor power. The ceremony's announcement reached the realm on the 8th of August, Prince Edward's third birthday, lending the union dual significance, both a celebration of monarchical continuity and a testament to the rapid shifts of royal favour. Despite the sovereign's 49 years, 28 years, Catherine's senior Henry appeared to find in her a solace previously unknown. He indulged her every whim, granting her jewels and robes of the finest Venetian silk. Courtiers spoke of his revived vigour, of the gleam in his eyes that had dimmed since the passing of Jane Seymour. They proclaimed Catherine a jewel of the crown, a bright new star in the royal firmament. Whispers of a grand coronation at Westminster circulated among the nobles. Should Catherine prove with child, the ceremony would enshrine her as queen consort in her own right, her image immortalized in stained glass, and on the walls of every chapel in the realm. Yet no authenticated portrait of Katherine Howard has survived. Her physical features remain cloaked in the soft haze of legend, as if the very paintbrushes had faltered before capturing her likeness. Instead, we rely on the pen of Charles de Marillac, the French ambassador, who described her in August 1540 as pretty of feature, graceful in countenance, small of stature, and given to the fashions of France. His words suggest a gentle beauty, one not overwhelming in its brilliance, but harmonious enough to complement a king's grand presence. In those early weeks, Henry's joy seemed boundless. He would lead Catherine through the hallways of Whitehall, his arms steady at her back, her laughter like church bells calling parishioners to worship. She greeted visiting dignitaries with a soft nod and poised courtesy, her gowns arranged in sweeping folds that spoke of courtly sophistication and youthful vivacity. She never outshone him, yet she glowed with a warmth that appeared to rekindle sparks in a monarch whose 6 marriages had drained his spirit. However, beneath the pageantry and the music, subtle shadows gathered. The hush of dawn, once broken by Catherine's laughter in the courtyard, now carried unanswered questions. Courtiers observed the Queen with curious glances. Was she bearing the child that would secure Tudor succession? Had her health and temperament settled into the steady composure expected of a queen? Even as Henry spoke of her with adulation, describing her as my dearest treasure, murmurs spread of unease. Some noted the flicker of anxiety in her eyes during formal audiences. Others spoke in secrecy of her pale cheeks when her husband's attentions grew too intense. For Catherine, the whirlwind ascent from orphaned ward to queen consort must have felt like floating upon a dream that trembled on the brink of dawn. She embraced her new station with the grace she had learned in Sussex's grand halls, yet the exhilaration of royal favour carried with it an undercurrent of peril. In her heart, she knew that the expectations of a Tudor queen were unyielding. To bear a son, to carry forth the dynasty, to embody the majesty of the crown. And should she falter, the very swords that had proclaimed her exaltation could, in turn, pronounce her downfall. Thus, amid the silken banners and the echoing songs of the royal chapel, Catherine's story entered its most luminous chapter. She stood at the pinnacle of power and devotion, dining in the presence of sovereigns and sending ripples across Europe. Yet, amid the splendour of July's celebration and the hope of Westminster's coronation, the seeds of tomorrow's trial lay quietly sown, ready to germinate beneath the frost of winter's coming chill. Early in 1541, as winter's chill seeped into the corridors of Whitehall, King Henry VIII was felled by a fierce fever. His old ulcer, dark and festering upon his leg, flared once more, sending waves of agony through his weakened body. The once merry monarch grew irritable and withdrawn, his temper flickering like a dying candle in a storm. Courtiers whispered of his mood swings. One moment he would summon laughter with gallant jests. The next he would lash out in frustration at the slightest misstep. This stark turn mirrored a pattern Catherine herself knew all too well, that of bright bloom giving way to withering disappointment. While Henry lay confined to his chamber, pale and feverish, Catherine's focus drifted from her royal duties. In the hush of candlelit evenings, she found herself longing for the company of Thomas Culper, the handsome courtier whose presence had once felt like sunshine after a storm. According to rumour, she sent him baskets of warm broth and little notes of sympathy during his own bouts of ill health. Under cover of twilight, and with the discreet help of Lady Rochford, once her governess's trusted companion Catherine and Culper stole away to Jane Seymour's former rooms, their meetings punctuated by furtive laughter and the soft rustle of silk garments. In those secret encounters, their passion exceeded the bounds of mere conversation. They whispered vows in hushed tones, their lips meeting in stolen kisses that fluttered like moths around a lamp. The walls of the chamber bore silent witness to their closeness, holding the echo of Culper's low murmurs as he promised loyalty beyond any courtly pledge. Catherine, still youthful and yearning, found in him the refuge she craved, unaware that each clandestine embrace sowed the seeds of her undoing. All secrets, however, must yield to light. In November 1541, whispers reached the ears of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, when John Lells and his niece Mary Hall, both former servants of the Dowager Duchess, brought forth tales of Catherine's past indiscretions. Her youthful liaisons with Manox and Dereham, intertwined now with Culper's forbidden tenderness. At first, Henry received the news with a brittle calm, brushing aside the accusations as mere gossip. But in the span of 3 days, his curiosity hardened to resolve, and he demanded a full inquiry into every corner of Catherine's life, summoning Manox, Dereham, Culper, and the witnesses to answer before the throne. On the 6th of November, the Crown's investigators presented their findings to the king. Depositions detailing the dates and places of secret meetings, letters bearing Catherine's own hand, and the servants' accounts of midnight confidences. The evidence formed a tapestry of betrayal that even Henry's own heart could not ignore. The very next day, November the 7th, Archbishop Cranmer, acting on the royal command, ordered Catherine's arrest. She wept in the grand hall as she confessed to the follies of youth, her tears glimmering upon her cheeks like dew in morning light. Culper, initially spared suspicion, was soon implicated when Francis Dereham's testimony revealed his part in the Queen's heart. Lady Rochford, whose loyalty had once seemed so steadfast, delivered the fullest confession of all, outlining the tangled web of secret rendezvous. By the 23rd of November, Katherine Howard's title was formally stripped from her. The court, once adorned in silks of celebration, now took on the muted tones of mourning. Manox, who had first aroused Catherine's emotions, escaped formal punishment his youth and rank sparing him the harshest consequences. Yet for Culper and Dereham, the penalty was severe. On the 1st of December, both were found guilty of treason and condemned to death. In the wake of these events, Henry VIII enacted a new statute, decreeing that any woman who concealed her premarital conduct would be guilty of treason. Thus, the very actions that had been whispered in secret chambers were cast into law as a betrayal of crown and country. In that winter of 1541, the court's gaiety froze into solemnity. Catherine, once celebrated as a bright new jewel at Henry's side, became a cautionary tale of youthful impulse and unchecked desire. The throne room, where torchlight had danced upon her lavish gowns, now stood silent, its tapestries absorbing the hush of her fall from grace. And in the hush, one heard the soft echo of her name once spoken in admiration, now uttered in regret. In the chill of that Tudor winter, the fates of all those entwined in Catherine's story were sealed, their destinies bound by the frail threads of trust and betrayal. Amid the king's unyielding fury, Catherine's fate was sealed beyond redemption. On the 13th of February 1542, the young queen, no more than 18, perhaps 21 years of age, stood upon the scaffold at the Tower of London, the chilly wind of late winter swirling around her. The date itself bore a cruel symmetry. Barely 19 months after her marriage, the woman who had been crowned with jewels now awaited the blade's descent. Legend whispers that her final words were, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culper." Yet historians, poring over the scant eyewitness accounts, regard this as little more than an enduring myth. In truth, Catherine knelt with measured composure, reciting the prescribed devotions of the condemned confession, exhortation, and prayer, then bent her neck as she had rehearsed, her last breath held in quiet resignation to the king's justice. Not long after, Margaret Lady Rochford Shelton, once Catherine's confidant and accomplice in secret meetings, met a similar end. Drummed out of favour and implicated by her own admissions, she too mounted the scaffold and fell by the same instrument that claimed the Queen. Their bodies were laid to rest side by side, the earth of the Tower's grounds absorbing their final stillness. In later centuries, when Queen Victoria ordered the restoration of the chapel, no trace of Catherine's remains was unearthed. She lives on only in the bronze tablet affixed to the western wall, commemorating those who perished within the Tower's grim embrace. Thus closed the brief, storm-tossed chapter of Katherine Howard's life, less than 2 years, as consort to England's most formidable monarch, and scarcely 2 decades upon the earth. Once cast as a wanton enchantress, a wicked witch of courtly mischief, she now emerges through the lens of modern scholarship as a vulnerable adolescent ensnared in the rivalries and expectations of an unforgiving royal household. Contemporary historians increasingly view her not as a deliberate schemer, but as a young girl buffeted by forces far greater than herself. Her story has become a call to re-examine the past with kinder eyes, especially when the subject is a woman whose reputation was shaped more by rumour than by fact. In the generations since her death, writers and researchers have unearthed new documents and reinterpreted old ones, revealing the complexities that lay behind the accusations of treason and moral turpitude. They ask whether a teenage queen, tutored in secrecy and bound by silent oaths, could ever stand equal to the ambitions of courtiers and the suspicions of a king who had once adored her. In popular culture, Katherine has inspired plays, novels, and even operas, each retelling her final days with a mixture of sorrow and sympathy. Audiences see her not merely as one more name on a list of Tudor consorts, but as a poignant symbol of youthful hope crushed beneath the weight of dynastic exigency. The hushed tones in which her tale is now whispered reflect a collective yearning to grant her the dignity and understanding that were denied her in life. On Tudor History Tours at the Tower, guides pause before the Western Chapel's memorial, recounting Catherine's short reign and harrowing demise. Visitors stand reverently, imagining her in her scarlet robes, gowns swept with ermine trim, making her final ascent to the scaffold as muffled footsteps of guards echoed in the stone courtyard. They sense the delicate threads of her narrative, threads of innocence, ambition, affection, and betrayal woven into the grand tapestry of England's royal past. Katherine Howard's legacy also resonates in academic circles, where her name is invoked in discussions of agency and autonomy. Scholars examine the statutes enacted after her downfall, laws mandating the disclosure of a bride's premarital history, as evidence of a society grappling with female sexuality and the extent to which a woman's loyalty was policed by law. In this light, her story transcends the particulars of Tudor scandal to illuminate broader themes of gender, power, and moral scrutiny. The Queen, whose life flickered so briefly upon the stage of Tudor drama, now endures as a lesson in compassion. She reminds us that behind every historical judgment lies the heartbeat of an individual, vulnerable to circumstance and prone to error. Catherine's descent from cradle to scaffold serves as a cautionary parable that youth can be exploited, that trust can be betrayed, and that history, once written in harsh judgment, can be rewritten with empathy. And so, when one recalls the rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, let it ring not as a curt epitaph, but as a gateway to deeper reflection. Katherine Howard's name may be spoken in the same breath as tragedy, but it also calls us to consider how we remember those who lived and suffered under the shadow of crowns. In the hush of the tower's stone walls, her spirit lingers no longer merely the subject of scandal, but a figure of remembrance, urging us to look again at the past with hearts both gentle and just. Within the cold stone walls of the Tower of London, Katherine Howard found herself imprisoned in a narrow cell that swallowed sound and light alike. The drab, uneven flagstones bore witness to the footfalls of sentries whose metallic boots echoed through the darkness. Above her, the vaulted ceiling arched into blackness, as though it sought to smother her very breath. In this place of hushed dread, Catherine's mind drifted to memories of her former life. Grand feasts in candlelit halls, where silver platters gleamed and nobles raised goblets of spiced wine, the gentle lilting of lutes and viols in royal chambers, and the vivid bouquets of roses and lilies laid upon her dressing table, tokens of affection from admirers now lost to time. These recollections shimmered like spectral images, dissolving at the edges much as dawn's mists vanish beneath the sun's first rays. Each day in her cell began with the same dull ache, a stiffness in her bones from the hard berth she shared with damp straw, and a sorrow that settled upon her chest like a weight. As the first pale light seeped beneath the barred door, she would lie still, eyes closed, allowing her thoughts to wander through the steps that had brought her here. She questioned in the quiet melancholy of pre-dawn. Had she been too naive, too hungry for acceptance, to foresee the snares laid by those older, more practiced in courtly machinations? Or had her tender heart been exploited her passions, coaxed by men who wielded power and privilege as instruments of their own advancement? In that silent watch, she wrestled with the shifting boundaries between youthful folly and deliberate betrayal. In those long hours of isolation, Catherine's pride softened. She resolved not to curse her fate, yet sorrow's sting was impossible to silence. With trembling fingers, she retrieved scraps of coarse paper and dipped a quill into stale ink, crafting letters to her younger sister, who remained sheltered at their grandmother's estate, and to her dearest companion, whose loyalty had shone even amid scandal's shadows. Each missive bore her unsettled script, letters blurred by tears that dampened the parchment, smearing the lines until they became a weave of grief. She did not beg for forgiveness. Rather, she pleaded for fairness, yearning that her brief missteps might be seen not as calculated treachery, but as the misadventures of youth. On the 23rd of November, the writ of attainder arrived, a royal decree stripping her of every title and privilege. In that moment of formal ruin, Catherine experienced a curious sense of liberation. No longer did she have to perform the role of queen in silken gowns and jeweled crowns, each step calculated for courtly display. She was freed from the burden of regal artifice, able at last to stand as herself. A young woman caught in the eddies of ambition and desire. Yet as the initial shock receded, she felt an ache of loss, an emptiness born from the realization that the crown she once held so lightly now lay heavy in history's ledger, her name scrawled beside the crime of passion. Still, peace remained elusive. Crown investigators returned to her cell, their questions sharper than any blade. They demanded further confessions, pressed her to recount every hidden meeting, every whispered promise. Catherine felt no terror of death itself. She had steeled her heart for the scaffold's company. What terrified her was the prospect that her innocent cravings for companionship, her stolen moments with Manox, Derham, and Culper, would be recast as willful treason, serving as instruments for her ultimate demise. Her soul trembled at the thought that the breathless laughter of secret romances would be twisted into the damning evidence that ended her life. On the eve of her execution, Catherine lay awake in the cavernous silence of her cell. The moon's pale light filtered through a narrow window, casting slender slats of brightness across the flagstones. These bars of light and shadow played upon the walls like the turns of fate in her life. Moments of radiance followed swiftly by encroaching darkness. She rose from her pallet and pressed her palm to the cold stone, feeling its chill seep into her fingertips. Gathering her courage, she spoke a soft farewell to the world beyond those walls, her voice barely more than a whisper. In the hush, she offered a final lullaby, weaving together memories and prayers, a hymn for the sleep that would follow her final breath. As dawn broke, those frail slats of light grew stronger, illuminating the path from cell to scaffold. Guards came to fetch her, their footsteps reverberating like distant thunder. Catherine lifted her chin, her gown of simple grey swaying around her ankles, the years of courtly splendour reduced to a widow's weeds. She walked with measured steps down the tower's stone corridors, the faces of onlookers hidden behind iron gratings. Each breath came slow and deliberate, as though she were drawing in the very essence of her life's story. At the scaffold's foot, Catherine knelt and recited the words of absolution in a clear, unhurried tone. The soft rustle of her skirts was the only sound, save for the hush of the crowd beyond the barrier. Her voice, steady yet gentle, carried across the hall, a final acknowledgement of past errors, a request for mercy that transcended royal decree. Then, in that suspended moment before the blade's descent, she closed her eyes, imagining once more the flicker of candlelight in Whitehall and the warmth of a rose's blossom. The executioner's steel fell with a muted thud, and Catherine's passage ended as the cold winter light watched in solemn silence. In the wake of her life's brief blaze, no more than 2 years atop the throne, and barely 2 decades upon the earth, her story settled into history's quiet register. Yet in the hush of memory, the echo of her final lullaby lingers, a poignant reminder of the fragile heart that beat beneath the crown, and of the human yearning for compassion, even in the face of the darkest judgments. At the first pale light of dawn on the 13th of February 1542, Katherine Howard was led from her damp cell to the scaffold erected on Tower Hill. A wooden barricade had been hastily constructed around the execution site, and the cold granite flags beneath her feet sent shivers up her spine. A raw east wind sighed through the gaps in the palisade, as though the very sky mourned her fate. Dressed in a simple, thin white gown of coarse wool, and clutching a linen veil in one hand and a small prayer book in the other, Katherine stepped forward with uncharacteristic calm. Her heart trembled only with the soft thud of mortality settling around her, yet her gaze was steady, as if she welcomed the moment with a serenity that belied her youth. A hushed throng of Londoners and royal guards ringed the scaffold, their faces pale in the morning haze. Commoners craned their necks for a better view, while soldiers stood in rigid rows, their spears pointed skyward like silent sentinels. None dared break the solemn quiet. The tension was as thick as fog rolling in from the Thames. Each measured step Katherine took toward the block was a testament to her resolve. She raised her chin, and though her eyes glistened, there remained a spark of faith, a conviction that life, however brief, was but a lesson, and that death was not the end, but a door to another realm. As she reached the scaffold's centre, Katherine paused to listen. Faintly she heard the distant peal of church bells, each toll a gentle benediction upon her soul. In that sacred resonance, she found a moment's respite from fear. The world around her fell away. No more the murmurs of a crowd, no more the jeers that once greeted her name in shadowed hallways. It was as though the universe itself had hushed to grant her a private communion with grace. Taking a measured breath, she knelt upon the cold boards, the rough texture pressing against her knees, and opened her prayer book. Her voice, soft yet clear, began the final confession, a litany of repentance drawn from verses worn smooth by countless readings. She spoke each word with deliberate care, as though it were a lullaby meant to soothe a frightened child. I confess to you, O Lord, my sins most grievous. Her tone never faltered. Each syllable drifted into the chill air and lingered like incense. There was no royal pomp in her act, no attempt to claim forgiveness by virtue of her former station. Instead, she stood, or rather knelt before God, as a penitent soul, unadorned and humble, offering her life as a final testament of contrition. When she concluded her prayer, Katherine rose with a quiet dignity. She placed the veil upon her shoulders and crossed her hands over her breast. In that still moment, the executioner stepped forward, his axe gleaming cold and unfeeling. There was only time enough for the faintest intake of breath and echo of life before the blade fell. A single stroke rang out with muted finality, the sound of steel meeting wood, and then silence reclaimed the morning. The last wisp of smoke from a tallow candle, still clutched in a guard's hand, drifted through the air, carrying the scent of burning wick and the solemn weight of destiny. For long moments the crowd stood motionless, neither cheering nor weeping. Slowly they turned away, their footsteps echoing hollowly across the stone expanse. The scaffold, once crowded with witnesses, now held only the still form of a girl whose life had ended in the prime of her youth. Above her, the tower's dark silhouette seemed to bow its ancient battlements in sorrow and remembrance. And in that frozen tableau, the harsh words of history began to be spoken. Executed for adultery and treason, as a queen who betrayed her vows. Yet those who have since studied her story know that the official record tells only half the truth. Katherine Howard was not merely a scheming traitor, but a vulnerable teenager, ensnared by the ambitions and desires of men far older and more powerful. Her youthful missteps, affairs born of loneliness, affection, and naivete, were twisted into instruments of political retribution. In the rigorous retelling of her demise, the human heart is often lost beneath the weight of verdicts. Today, when visitors pause before the tower's Western Chapel tablet, they are reminded of Katherine not as a cautionary tale of royal scandal, but as a figure whose brief life compels us to consider the complexity of judgment. Her memory has become an emblem of compassion in historical discourse, a call to grant those who falter the space to be understood, rather than swiftly condemned. In the hush that follows the telling of her end, there lies an invitation to reflect, a quiet interlude, before the axe of verdict falls upon another life. And so, as dusk settles upon history's pages, Katherine Howard stands not only as a name in a rhyme, but as a whisper of mercy across the centuries, urging us to temper judgment with empathy, to remember the fragile heartbeat behind every headline, and to honor the silence that precedes our final understanding. More than 4 centuries have passed since Katherine Howard met her tragic end. and the prism through which we view her has gradually shifted. In the early years of Tudor historiography, she was cast as a wanton temptress, arrogant, frivolous, and reckless in her disregard for royal duty. Yet as time unfurled, scholars began to peer beyond the scandal, seeking the human being beneath the headlines. Recent research has invited us to ask, could a girl of 16 or 17 truly possess the agency to resist the currents of royal power and courtly intrigue that surrounded her? Many historians now assert that Catherine was, above all, a casualty of Henry's system, a realm in which women held little voice and even less autonomy. Brought to court as a plaything of fate, she was expected to obey without question, then judged and executed before the ink on her verdict had fully dried. In this light, her story becomes less a cautionary tale of moral failure and more an indictment of an unequal society that allowed power to become oppression. Far from deserving contempt, she elicits our compassion as we acknowledge the injustice of her situation. Modern authors depict Catherine as a tender, headstrong adolescent, eager to taste the sweetness of affection yet vulnerable to deceivers and design. In an age when the church presided over every aspect of private life, she had no recourse but to conceal her youthful indiscretions behind a veil of silence. When those secrets spilled forth, they were wielded as weapons against her, turning whispers into the instruments of her demise. And so she fell not solely for her own mistakes, but for the failures of those who guided, protected, and ultimately betrayed her. Her execution resonates as a question of justice and morality. At what point does authority tip into tyranny? When does the law serve only those in power, rather than safeguarding the innocent and the inexperienced? Catherine's brief life, no more than 2 years marked by royal favour, became a clarion call to judge others with a tempering of mercy, especially young women whose choices are too often constrained by the will of stronger forces. Today, Catherine's tale finds new life on stage and screen, in documentaries and classroom modules, as educators strive to present history as more than a ledger of winners and losers. They invite audiences to witness the fragility of a girl caught in the crosscurrents of ambition, desire, and fear. In these retellings, she stands as a symbol of sorrow and yearning, the universal craving for freedom from bonds that are both visible and unseen. On academic forums and social media alike, Catherine's name now evokes empathy rather than scorn. She was only a young girl seeking love in a glittering yet merciless world, one historian observed, capturing the prevailing sentiment of modern scholarship. In remembering her, we honour the quiet resilience that carried her through moments of grandeur and despair. It is that resilience and the lessons her life imparts that endures, reminding us always to pause before casting judgment, and to listen for the soft echoes of empathy that transcend the sharp edges of history's verdicts. In recent years, writers and filmmakers have begun to re-examine Katherine Howard's story through a feminist lens, portraying her not merely as a victim, but as a young woman who dared to love and who craved freedom within the rigid confines of a Tudor court. In these modern adaptations, Catherine emerges as an emblem of autonomy, someone willing to risk everything, even her own life, in pursuit of agency and emotional fulfillment. Her struggles resonate with audiences today who recognize the cost often exacted from women who assert their desires. Some novelists delve into Catherine's inner turmoil, crafting historical fiction that alternates between the pride she felt upon stepping into her queenly role and the loneliness she endured in the Tower's frigid cells. They vividly recount her first tender moments with Manox, the delicate thrill of discovering affection, and then transport readers to her final act of piety as she knelt to pray. Those narratives bring to life a Catherine who is more genuine, vulnerable, and pitiable than any commanding queen, showing the human beneath the crown. On television, series such as The Tutors and Wolf Hall, while not always focusing exclusively on Catherine, nevertheless leave a lasting image of her fragile beauty, her pale French hood, framing eyes that flicker between hope and fear as she faces the king's wrath. Viewers remember that fleeting, haunting presence, a young woman overshadowed by ambition and betrayed by the very system that elevated her. In these dramatizations, Catherine stands apart from the scheming consorts around her, embodying innocence amid intrigue. In Western history classrooms, educators have introduced dedicated modules on Katherine Howard's private life, using her as a case study to illustrate how women are judged more harshly than men. Students engage in debates. If placed in Catherine's position, how would they navigate the treacherous waters of court politics? These discussions transcend simple chronology, prompting young learners to consider ethics, power dynamics, and the enduring struggle for gender equality. In England, history societies organise guided tours of the Tower of London that pause before the memorial plaque dedicated to Catherine. Tour leaders adopt a gentle tone, inviting visitors to listen for the soft echoes of her past, and to imagine themselves as a young girl caught between duty and desire. This immersive approach transforms a stone and iron fortress into a living narrative, inspiring empathy rather than judgment. Across popular culture, Katherine Howard's memory has become a testament to the multiplicity of historical perspectives. Enthusiasts create artwork, podcasts, and social media threads that explore her life as a portrait of compassion rather than scandal. Poetry and song lyrics reference her fleeting reign and mournful end, reminding audiences that history is not a monolith, but a tapestry woven from diverse human experiences. The feminist reinterpretation of Catherine's life also underscores broader questions about justice and autonomy. When does societal authority cross the line into oppression? How do legal systems privilege the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable? Catherine's brief story, her swift rise and precipitous fall, rings as a cautionary anthem, urging us to temper our judgments with mercy and to examine the structures that constrain individual freedom. In reimagining her tale on stage, screen, and in the classroom, we honour Catherine's legacy not as a mere footnote in a rhymed mnemonic, but as a vivid symbol of resilience amid adversity. Her life beckons us to revisit old narratives, to question accepted truths, and to seek the empathy that transcends centuries. In the soft hush of reflection, Katherine Howard's story becomes more than history. It becomes an enduring call for compassion, forgiveness, and the pursuit of equality. Katherine Howard's tragic end stands not merely as a cautionary tale of another era, but as an echo that resonates still in our own time. In the 21st century, when conversations about women's rights and gender equality have taken center stage, her story serves as a potent reminder: young women deserve protection from exploitation and from snap judgments that fail to appreciate the vulnerability of tender hearts. Each choice made in life, especially by those whose feelings are fresh and undeveloped, merits compassion and understanding rather than condemnation. Today's scholars continue to unearth documents, letters, and wills in a tireless quest to piece together Catherine's true likeness. They pore over the language of her correspondences, noting each carefully chosen phrase. They chart her journey from Norfolk's gracious halls to the shadowy stone corridors of the Tower, redrawing historical maps to reflect the pathways she walked. Cutting-edge AR and VR technologies now allow students and history enthusiasts alike to step virtually into the very cells where she waited, to peer through the narrow window slits that once framed her view of the world beyond those walls. In these digital reconstructions, Catherine's final days are no longer locked in dusty archives, but come alive in three-dimensional space, where the soft glimmer of torchlight and the chill of stone can be felt almost physically. On social media platforms, devoted circles of Tudor history lovers mark Catherine's death anniversary by sharing poignant excerpts from contemporary chronicles and by quoting what may have been her own words. "Though I was far from perfect, I lived with all the depth of my heart." These lines reverberate across feeds, touching thousands of timelines and reminding us all of the fundamental rights to love freely, to err without shame, and to seek forgiveness when we falter. The influence of Catherine's life extends into modern art as well. Illustrators craft delicate watercolours that capture a young woman in a flame-red gown, eyes downcast yet brimming with unspoken dreams. Audiobook narrators transform her story into soothing monologues, while the popular podcast Sleepy History dedicates entire episodes to her biography, its narrator's gentle cadence guiding listeners through each tumultuous turn before lulling them toward restful slumber. In every episode's closing, the host offers the same tender counsel: let the past teach you. Let compassion be your compass. Through these myriad efforts, academic, digital, artistic, Katherine Howard's legacy transcends the scandal that once defined her. She emerges as more than a footnote in Tudor annals. She becomes a symbol of the enduring struggle for empathy across the ages. Her brief life, filled with both longing and loss, invites us to pause before casting judgment and to remember that behind every historical verdict stands a human heart, fragile and yearning for understanding. In reflecting upon her story, we affirm our commitment to protect the vulnerable, to temper our judgments with mercy, and to ensure that the lessons of the past guide us toward a more compassionate future. And now, as the echoes of Katherine Howard's story still resonate within the cold walls of the Tower of London, let us move on to the next 5 chapters, where we will reunite with the faces that have left their mark on her fate. From her father, who struggled beneath the weight of debt, to her grandmother, stern yet full of love. From her music teacher, Henry Manox, and her secretary, Francis Dereham, to the noble Thomas Culper, enraptured, and the powerful king alongside her loyal friend Margaret Shelton, all will emerge in sharper relief. Each chapter will unfold like a lullaby, revealing how these relationships wove the tapestry of her destiny, from tender affection to cruel betrayal, from indulgence to harsh judgment, shaping the enduring tragedy of a Tudor maiden. Thus, our journey now turns to examine Catherine's parents and family origins, whose sacrifices, expectations, and decisions would shape the course of her life. In the quiet dawn of Katherine Howard's earliest years, her world revolved around 2 figures whose influence shaped every breath she drew: her father, Lord Edmund Howard, and her mother, Joyce Culper. Though their names now appear in dusty tomes, their presence was once as vivid to Katherine as the flicker of candlelight upon her cradle. Lord Edmund Howard was a man of noble bearing and modest means, his manners formed by lineage, yet tempered by hardship. He moved through his Lambeth manor with the gravity expected of the Duke of Norfolk's 3rd son, shoulders squared, head held high, as if the weight of his family's honour rested upon him alone. Guests arriving at the great hall would find him presiding over the long oak table, robes trimmed in subdued velvet, his gauntleted hand tapping a carved silver cup when he made a point. He spoke of duty and decorum, reminding Katherine, still barely more than a toddler, that the Howard name carried both privilege and obligation. In his measured tones, he extolled the virtues of loyalty to crown and country, insisting that each member of his household comport themselves with dignity. Yet beneath his polished exterior lay the constant murmur of worry. Ledgers kept in his own hand recorded debts that climbed like ivy on a weathered wall. Loans from friends, delayed payments to merchants, the occasional plea for leniency from creditors. Katherine learned early that silver coin did not always accompany silver tongue. She would see her father lingering in the study until lanterns guttered low, Quill scratching late into the night as he struggled to balance honour with necessity. From him she inherited a sense of gravitas far beyond her years, but also the unsettling knowledge that noble birth did not guarantee security. It was Edmund who made the fateful decision to send Katherine to her grandmother's care, a move intended to secure her education and her future. When Joyce passed away, her loss left a chasm no father's arms could fully fill. Edmund, aware of his mounting obligations and limited resources, entrusted his daughter to the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. In a formal missive, he spoke of ensuring Katherine learned the arts of court dancing, reading, riding, and of shielding her from the tumult of his debts. Thus began Katherine's journey into the palace world, guided by her grandmother's firm hand, a path laid by her father's mixture of hope and desperation. Joyce Culper, known affectionately as Jack Castor, was the quiet counterpoint to Edmund's strictures. A woman of soft voice and resolute spirit, she bore 11 children to adulthood, a rarity in an age when infant mortality stalked every cradle. Each birth taxed her strength, yet she welcomed every child with steadfast devotion. In the nursery's gentle light, Joyce would cradle her newborns against her breast, murmuring lullabies in a language of compassion and courage. To Katherine, her mother was both fortress and comfort. The soft rustle of silk skirts as Joyce swept through the room, the scent of lavender and rosewater that clung to her gown, the whispered prayers Joyce taught her at dawn. From Joyce, Katherine learned resilience and sacrifice. She watched her mother rise before the sun to oversee the household, organizing meals of porridge and bread, tending to younger siblings, tending the wounded pride of a father burdened by debt. When plague swept through neighbouring villages or storm clouds gathered over the Thames, Joyce's calm presence in the hearth-lit parlour offered Katherine a model of steadfast faith. It was Joyce who read aloud the stories of saints who faced suffering with grace, instilling in her daughter a belief that endurance and kindness were the truest measures of nobility. Yet even the strongest hearts can break. When Joyce succumbed to sickness, the household fell silent. Catherine, at the tender age of 6, found herself adrift in a world suddenly cold. The cradle that had rocked gently beneath Joyce's watchful gaze felt empty. In the days that followed, Catherine roamed the silent corridors, searching for her mother's scent, the soft echo of her footsteps. Edmund's heavy eyes conveyed grief, but offered little comfort. The debt still loomed, and the demands of noble life permitted scant time for mourning. It was in that void where a child's longing mingled with the hush of a father's restraint that Catherine's yearning for affection grew most acute. She learned to crave the warmth of another's embrace, to cling to the memory of her mother's soothing songs. And so, when the Dowager Duchess welcomed her to Chaworth House under the guise of education, Catherine carried in her heart both the lessons of relentless duty from her father and the tender love of her mother, two currents that would carry her into the turbulent tides of courtly intrigue. In those earliest chapters, shaped by Edmund's expectations and Joyce's devotion, the foundation of Katherine Howard's fate was laid. Through her father's insistence on honour amid hardship and her mother's example of sacrifice in the face of mortality, she learned that nobility could be both burden and blessing, and that the absence of love could leave a void too large for any crown to fill. Thus, our focus now shifts to Catherine's grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, whose firm hand and lofty expectations would guide and confine the young girl in equal measure. The Dowager Duchess ruled her household with an iron courtesy. Each morning, long before the sun's pale light crept through mullioned windows, she would make her rounds of the great chambers. Portraits of sovereigns and saints lined the oak-panelled walls, their sombre gazes reminding all who passed that lineage and faith were inseparable. She expected punctuality. No footstep should echo in the corridors before the first toll of the chapel bell, and no voice should rise above the hush of devotion until after matins. In Catherine's presence, the Duchess moved like a queen in miniature, her embroidered kirtle barely rustling as she inspected needlework, corrected a curtsy, or adjusted the placement of a French hood. Under her watch, the household became a finely tuned instrument of protocol. Discipline under the Duchess was rigorous, yet intended to prepare Catherine for life at court. Etiquette formed the warp of her education. Catherine learned to bend the knee with the precise angle required to convey both respect and dignity. She practiced the intricate steps of the pavane and the galliard for hours each afternoon, her gown's hem whispering against the polished floor. Music lessons followed in a vaulted chamber, where candles flickered upon instruments, lutes, viols, and the virginal each note drilled until her fingers could dance across ivory keys without hesitation. The Duchess insisted on mastery. Every movement, every gesture, every chord had to be carried out with exactness befitting a noble woman destined for high station. Yet this strict regimen was not born of cruelty, but of conviction. The Dowager Duchess believed deeply that only through such discipline could Catherine survive the harsh realities of Tudor politics. She would often remind her granddaughter of the fates of those who failed to uphold their duties, consorts who had fallen from favour, their names erased from court annals. In those admonishments lay genuine concern. She sought to arm Catherine with the tools necessary to navigate intrigue and ambition, to preserve both life and station. Their relationship was one of guardianship and governance, a courtier and charge dynamic in miniature. The Duchess assumed the mantle of mentor, stepping in after Catherine's mother passed away, offering both structure and expectation. For Catherine, this bond was a lifeline. She found solace in the routine of lessons and the clarity of rules. Yet, as she matured, the same embrace began to feel like a restraint. The Duchess's ever-watchful eye, so comforting in its constancy, also became a heavy cloak around Catherine's desires, taming the spirit that longed for more exuberant expression. This dual influence shaped Catherine's adolescence with stark contrasts. On one hand, she gained confidence in her abilities. She curtsied before visiting dignitaries without a tremor, held her posture erect enough to pass muster in any courtly gathering, and performed dances with such grace that even seasoned ladies praised her poise. On the other hand, she felt the limitations of her gilded cage. Forbidden from the company of certain pages, barred from unsupervised strolls through the orchard, and never permitted a moment's privacy, Catherine's youthful spontaneity was stifled. The lessons that ought to have empowered her also bound her, teaching obedience more than independence. As Catherine's skill in music and dance grew, so did her awareness of the world beyond the Duchess's strictures. She watched with yearning as older ladies whispered behind lace fans, their laughter tinged with secrets she was not yet allowed to share. She glimpsed the vibrancy of anger and delight in eyes that the Duchess had taught her to respect without question. In those stolen moments, Catherine felt the stirrings of rebellion, a quiet questioning of the rules that had governed her every breath. Nevertheless, she honoured the Duchess's guidance. Whenever the Dowager Duchess corrected her posture or rehearsed yet another bow, Catherine strove to meet the expectation with a serene smile, as though every discipline were a gift rather than a burden. She recognized that the Duchess, though inflexible, had acted out of love, seeking to equip her for a destiny fraught with peril, and so she accepted the contradictory nature of that care, a stern scaffold for a tender heart. Through this dual influence, stern discipline on one side and nurturing instruction on the other, Katherine Howard grew from a grieving child into a poised young lady, ready to face the world of Tudor court. Yet the very structure that fashioned her elegance also confined her spirit, setting the stage for the conflicts that would later define her brief reign. In the Dowager Duchess's grand halls and under her watchful gaze, Catherine learned both the strength of noble bearing and the price of constrained freedom, lessons that would echo through every step she took thereafter. Building upon the lessons instilled by her grandmother, Catherine's next significant influences came in the persons of two tutors, Henry Manox and Francis Dereham, whose affections would both awaken and wound her young heart. Henry Manox, the music master at Chaworth House, arrived as a gentle guide through the world of melody and harmony. By day he stood at the virginal, demonstrating the precise arch of a finger and the soft press of an ivory key, while Catherine watched with rapt attention. His voice, low and encouraging, offered praise when she achieved a clear tone, drawing from her a shy smile that lit up the curtained practice room. Yet as their lessons progressed, Manox, older by at least a decade, allowed professional boundaries to blur. In whispered exchanges behind fluttering tapestries, his hand would linger a moment too long as he corrected her posture. The warmth of his breath at her neck, once mistaken for admiration of her talent, became the beginning of a dangerous intimacy. Their relationship, born of musical instruction, quickly passed the threshold of propriety. On one afternoon, cloaked in the hush of the chapel's side aisles, Catherine felt him press her close and confessed that she had enchanted him beyond reason. The imbalance between teacher and child was stark. She, barely in her mid-teens, drawn by his attention. He, an adult whose affection carried the weight of power. When the Dowager Duchess, patrolling the corridors with stern resolve, discovered the pair locked in a furtive embrace, she struck Catherine with a harsh reprimand and ordered Manox away. Yet the lessons he taught were not so easily discarded. He had awakened in her a longing for tenderness, entwined with a dawning fear that love given by those in authority could so swiftly transform into something coercive. Shaken but not cowed, Catherine found in Francis Dereham a very different companion. As secretary to the Dowager Duchess, Dereham carried ledgers and delivered messages, his easy confidence a welcome contrast to Manox's brooding intensity. He would slip into Catherine's attendant suite, bearing baskets of ripened fruit and flasks of spiced wine, his warm greeting putting her at ease. Their shared laughter echoed down corridors, and under the moonlight they would stroll through the Elizabethan gardens, dreaming aloud of a future unmarred by debt or decree. Dereham declared himself her husband in earnest yet playful whispers, and Catherine, buoyed by his sincerity, allowed herself to believe in his vows. This liaison, unlike the secretive affair with Manox, played out with more openness among the household staff. Servants exchanged knowing glances as Catherine and Dereham spoke of marriage in soft tones, calling each other wife and husband, with a seriousness that mingled youthful fantasy and genuine affection. Yet as the spring winds sharpened, so too did Dereham's devotion curdle into possessiveness. He began to demand Catherine's presence at every turn, his whispered entreaties growing urgent. "Stay with me," he insisted, "and no one else shall claim your heart." The ardour that once felt protective shifted into a subtle tyranny, binding Catherine within the very affection she had sought. Realizing that his jealousy threatened to suffocate her, Catherine summoned the courage to end their public courtship around 1539. She distanced herself from Dereham's gaze, leaving him to wander the echoing halls with hollow regret. The act of breaking his vow, a vow she had once encouraged hurt more than any rebuke from her grandmother. It taught her that even the most earnest promises could become chains, constricting rather than liberating. From Manox, she learned the peril of power misused, how a teacher's kindness could become manipulation. From Derham, she gleaned the bittersweet lesson that love without freedom can become its own form of captivity. Each tutor introduced Katherine to the joys and dangers of longing, awakening in her a deeper understanding of her own heart's frailty. Though these early entanglements would later be held against her in the unforgiving glare of Tudor judgment, they also forged within her a resilience and self-awareness that no royal decree could undo. Thus, as she navigated the treacherous currents of courtly life, Katherine carried with her the echoes of these formative relationships, notes of music and concealed vows, woven into the tapestry of her destiny, underscoring every choice she would make on the path to her ultimate, tragic fate. Building on the lessons of misplaced trust from her earlier tutors, Katherine's heart next found refuge in the gilded, yet perilous embrace of Thomas Culper, her third and most fateful attachment. Their paths crossed in the hush of courtly ritual, within the very chambers once occupied by Queen Jane Seymour. Those rooms, tucked away beyond the main hall's splendour, were rarely visited except for private audiences or the hush of confessions. It was there, among the heavy velvet draperies and soft glow of candelabras, that Katherine first encountered Culper, thanks to the discreet aid of Lady Rochford. Margaret Shelton, once Katherine's governess and now her trusted attendant, had long observed the Queen's loneliness, the isolation that clung to Katherine as tightly as her ornate gowns. When Lady Rochford slipped a note into Culper's hand inviting him to join Katherine in the former Queen's private suite, she believed she was easing the Queen's solitude, not knowing how deeply that moment would shape history. Thomas Culper was all the court's whispered promise of charm and confidence. A member of the King's privy chamber, he moved with the ease of one accustomed to wielding influence behind closed doors. His shoulders bore fine fabrics of midnight blue and rich burgundy, and his speech, lightly laced with witty banter, could transform a stiff audience into a circle of attentive listeners. Women turned to watch him pass. Men leaned forward to catch his smile. To Katherine, who had been taught to curtsy and measured grace, Culper's very presence felt like a new kind of dance, one that stirred unfamiliar currents in her chest. In those secret gatherings within Jane Seymour's rooms, Katherine discovered a space where her emotions were mirrored rather than measured. Culper offered her more than companionship. He offered understanding. He listened when she confided her fears of courtly intrigue, of whispers that flickered through corridors like wind-blown petals. When she spoke of the suffocating weight of expectations of bearing the crown's hopes, he set aside his fine gloves and took her hand, his touch a balm to her restless spirit. For Katherine, used to performing the part of queen under watchful eyes, Culper became an emotional anchor, grounding her in moments of frenzy. Their clandestine encounters deepened not only Katherine's affection for Culper, but also her understanding of her own vulnerability. In the flicker of candlelight, they would speak of futures unchained by protocol, of laughter shared in gardens beyond the palace walls. Culper's hand at the small of her back led her through the labyrinth of her own desires, guiding her toward a freedom she had not known she craved. Yet each stolen moment carried the echo of danger. A servant's footstep in the hall, a distant murmur of voices through silk hangings, and the ever-present risk that those walls would soon bear witness to something far more damning than whispered declarations. This secret relationship, concealed behind layers of etiquette and sealed by Lady Rochford's complicity, sowed the seeds of tragedy. In the privacy of twilight, Katherine's laughter rang free, but by dawn's light her heart beat with a tension that no royal diadem could soothe. She pressed letters into hidden folds of Culper's cloak, words of longing, lines that fluttered like moths in his pocket, carrying her devotion through the corridors of power. For a time, this intimacy felt like salvation, the shield against the rumours that swirled in the outer courts, the counterpoint to the loneliness that had shadowed her since childhood. Yet when Francis Derham's confession and Manox's testimony had already paved a path of suspicion, the discovery of her notes to Culper shattered the fragile peace she had known. The very devotion that had buoyed her spirit became the evidence that doomed her. Henry, the king, who had once called her his jewel, heard of these secret meetings and saw in them not the cry of a young woman for affection but the ambition of a traitor. The letters, once pressed to her heart, were now pressed into royal records, their ink becoming the stark script of her indictment. Thus, the emotional refuge she had found with Thomas Culper became the catalyst for her downfall. Each clandestine embrace, once sweet with promise, echoed in the cold chambers of the tower, and in those echoing halls, Katherine faced the cruel lesson that trust, once betrayed, could no longer anchor her in safety. The love that had given her strength became the very instrument of her ruin, reminding us that the heart's tender yearnings can carry the heaviest price when constrained by crown and country. Building upon the ruinous consequences of her secret liaison with Culper, Catherine's fate was further sealed by the man whose favour she most coveted, King Henry VIII, and by the very confidant who had quietly facilitated her forbidden meetings, Lady Rochford. Henry VIII's relationship with Catherine began in a blaze of youthful infatuation. In the weeks following Anne of Cleves's annulment, the 49-year-old monarch found himself captivated by Catherine's vivacity. He lavished upon her gifts of cloth of gold and jewels set with rubies, stroking her cheek in public audiences, as if she were the light returning to his waning days. He called her "my jewel," and courtiers spoke in hushed awe of the king's renewed vigour. Yet as swiftly as his adoration had ignited, it turned to fury when whispers of her indiscretions reached his ears. The same power that had elevated her to queen consort became the instrument of her punishment. Henry ordered investigations into her past, revoked her titles by royal decree, and even reshaped marriage policy, mandating that any concealment of a bride's prior liaisons would henceforth constitute treason. In this way, he used the full force of the crown's authority not only to condemn Catherine, but also to enshrine his wrath within the very laws of the realm. Standing beside Catherine throughout these turbulent episodes was Margaret Shelton, better known as Lady Rochford. Once her governess, and later her trusted companion, Lady Rochford occupied a paradoxical place in her life. To Catherine, she was at first a comforting presence, an aunt figure who smoothed her hair when the Queen's French hood felt too heavy and tucked anonymous notes into Culper's cloak. Lady Rochford's loyalty seemed unwavering. She offered her chambers for clandestine meetings and shielded Catherine from immediate suspicion. Yet in the harsh light of later interrogations, her complicity took on a more calculating hue. Was she driven purely by devotion to her young charge, or did she see Catherine's vulnerability as a means to maintain her own sway within the court? As the conduit between queen and courtier, Lady Rochford bore witness to their whispered vows and carried their messages through service corridors. In the hush of Jane Seymour's former suite, she arranged the benches and draped the curtains to guarantee privacy. In return, she earned not only Catherine's trust, but also a place in the damning list of accomplices drawn up by Henry's investigators. When Francis Derham's testimony hinted at Culper's involvement, Margaret's own name surfaced among the accused. Like Catherine, she found herself stripped of honour and cast into the Tower's dark cells. Together, Catherine, Culper, and Lady Rochford became entwined in the same tragic tapestry. Catherine's emotional refuge with Thomas Culper, arranged in part by Lady Rochford's discreet hand, formed the cornerstone of the charges that would lead to their downfall. Henry's wrath, once tempered by affection, transformed into a legal purge that reshaped the kingdom's approach to marriage and female chastity. The Queen's rise and fall thus hinged on the very relationships that had once promised solace and companionship Monox's early lessons of desire. Derham's public devotion turned sour, Culper's gallant affection, and Lady Rochford's earnest facilitation. In the end, Catherine's life was claimed not only by the blade that fell on Tower Hill, but also by the relentless tides of power wielded by Henry VIII and the quiet complicity of those closest to her. The king, in his final decree, ensured that no woman could again escape scrutiny, while Lady Rochford's name became forever linked to the Queen's tragedy, a testament to how loyalty can become a double-edged sword. Thus, in the convergence of royal impulse and personal allegiance, we see how affection can illuminate a court, only to burn with unforgiving intensity when crossed. Katherine Howard's story, entwined with those of Henry VIII and Lady Rochford, stands as a timeless reminder of the perils that await when love, power, and loyalty collide beneath the weight of a crown. And so, dear listener, as the final embers of Katherine Howard's tale flicker softly against the shadowed stones of history, we gently draw down the curtain on her life's drama. Let us slow our breath and ease our thoughts, imagining now the hush of a Tudor dusk settling over the tower, mists curling like silk ribbons around its turrets, and the last echoes of royal footsteps fading into stillness. In this quiet moment, we remember that her story, though marked by passion, power, and pain, ultimately calls us back to the enduring value of compassion, the delicate strength of empathy, and the timeless reminder that every human heart, no matter how exalted, can be fragile and in need of kindness. We carry forward a message that transcends centuries, that when we pause to understand one another's struggles and offer gentle forgiveness for youthful missteps, we honor the deepest hopes of every soul. Catherine's brief bloom as queen, and the crown of sorrow that followed, remind us to protect the vulnerable, to question swiftly cast judgments, and to cherish the tender bonds of trust that sustain us all. In her confessions, her letters, her final whispered prayers, we hear not only the echoes of a bygone court, but also the soft murmur of hope that even in the darkest chambers, the human spirit longs for grace. And now, as we let the last tendrils of her history drift away like petals on a calm pond, may you feel a gentle calmness settle around you, a serene warmth as you prepare to rest. Allow your mind to float beyond the stone ramparts and moonlit gardens, carried on the quiet breeze of understanding and mercy. Let the closing chords of this story lull you toward peaceful slumber, each breath a soft wave washing over the shores of your dreams. Good night, dear friends. May your dreams be filled with compassion's light, and may you awaken refreshed by the knowledge that every life, even one written in the margins of royal scandal, holds lessons of empathy and grace. If the quiet journey through Katherine Howard's world has touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel, so that each new evening you might join us for other gentle tales, thoughtfully told and lovingly whispered. Sleep well, and we will see you again soon with our next story, crafted just for you.